Welcome back to the channel. I am your host for today, Claire Headley, and it is my pleasure to introduce joining me today, Rachel Bernstein, therapist, cult expert, cult recovery expert, author, educator, podcaster. Did I miss anything significant and important?
MOUSC. No, we're good. That covers it.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining me today for my Life After Scientology series. And my favorite for you is you're the first psychologist I ever spoke with, ever.
Wow.
It was a long time ago.
Right? It was a long time ago. Yeah. And knowing just that phrase then and how triggering that whole idea is to a former Scientologist, I have a real sense of the gravity of that moment and the bravery that was needed for it.
Yes, well, I appreciate it. We've had many, many conversations over the years, of course, on your podcast and in real life and everything else. But thank you for being such a knowledgeable expert that enabled me to cross that bridge because, yes, it was a very scary bridge to cross, but one that I very much needed to cross.
Mm-hmm. You're
Yeah.
welcome. I'm glad I could be there when needed.
Yes, absolutely. And so first, maybe you could just give me well, actually, let me start with this because I don't know the answer to this and I'm curious. So how and when did Scientology spark interest for you? Like, how did that come about?
So, when I was actually in middle school, one of my siblings got into Scientology very briefly. And so it became dinner table conversation. And part of the conversation at the time, this was in the 70s, was that there really wasn't information out there and that the only books that you could find on Scientology were by L. Ron Hubbard, which was not going to be helpful. But what I noticed right away was that there was a personality shift in my sibling. There was more secrecy. There was this idea that somehow her family couldn't be trusted. And then she got involved through a high school friend. And then this high school friend was someone who we had sort of known here and there. And my parents decided before barring my sibling from going back, that they would call this high school friend's parents to find out, listen, if this is really a good thing and this has really helped, this is what your daughter has needed, then okay, we'll be open-minded. And these parents were so happy to be called and said, we don't know what's happened to our daughter. And we're so alarmed and we're so scared. And we go for weeks without talking to her, knowing where she is. And that was, this girl's definition of getting along better with her family or handling her parents. And that even alarmed my sibling, who didn't know that was really in the cards for her as well.
Wow.
And so, right. And then it's just something that my father actually got very involved in wanting to educate people about, because he cared a lot about families and keeping families intact and the sanctity of those relationships. And he would go to schools and talk about cults. He had to learn kind of on his own. And so by the time I went off to college, I had already learned about front names of different groups, thinking, sometimes kids think their parents are a little paranoid, like, oh, the cults are not around every corner. And so fine, they're overreacting. And there I was. It was actually at Boston University. And I went to the student union and I saw all of these tables with the names of these front groups for cults. And the school had no idea that this is what they were housing and giving space for, to recruit people who were then going to have to drop out of school once they got involved. And I thought, wow, this is a real thing. And this
Yeah.
is really underhanded and awful. And you could get your kids on a path that you work really hard and they work really hard to get to, and then have them basically kidnapped away from their life and their path. And there's no one out there helping or watching. At least that's how it felt. So
For
then I
sure.
got involved with, it was CAN at the time. That was the organization that now is not one to be involved in.
No.
And
Cult Awareness Network, which probably we could do an entire episode just on that, but yes, go ahead.
right, yes, right. So it was legit when it started, and now is a Scientology front.
Mhm.
And I remember talking to people there who had had horrible experiences. And then to answer, this is sort of the last piece of this answer to this question, when I first started, and when I became a therapist and I first started working at the cult clinic in Los Angeles, within about a month, I was harassed by Scientology. And
Wow.
they complained to my board. They and here I'm this like young kid, and the ink is still drying on my license. I don't what is going on. I'm just trying to help people. And someone was sent to my office to pretend to be a client, and then I got a full transcript of that session with a little handwritten note at the top that said, "We're listening and we're watching." And I thought, that is beyond creepy. And what?
Mhm.
And then someone who came to see me, who had climbed out a window, who was on RPF, because my office was near a lot of the Hollywood buildings. She then was followed and to my office, and then followed back, and people then knew that I was helping her in any way that I felt like I could. I was still new to the field. I don't know how much I was able to help her, but that's when it really ramped up. And that's when, what was his name? Eugene Ingram and his minion, J.J. Gaw at the time, they were
And of
suddenly,
course, their private investigator, Eugene Ingram, must be the most famous private investigator Scientology has had, at least in recent history.
yeah, right. And here he's leaning on my car outside the clinic at the end of the day. And he's this big, scary dude. I don't know, at the time, he felt very scary to me. And I had never met
Yeah.
anyone like that. And he wouldn't let me get to my car. He was leaning on the door and said, "You better stop doing what you're doing." And then would follow me home. And I thought, what is this? And I stayed home for a few days. I was scared. And then I heard, my dad had since passed, unfortunately, at a young age, but I heard his voice kind of ringing true in that moment where he said, "You can't let the bullies win." And so I went back to work on Monday. And
Wow.
I'm just going to have to deal with this. And people who have been in the system are going to be treated even worse than this. So someone needs to be out there helping.
Wow. Amazing. Gosh, that was a much more in-depth answer than I was expecting. But again, I truly was really curious, and I always find it so fascinating, the interweavings and the paths that have kind of how my path crossed yours, for example. It's
Mm,
fascinating, and just thank you for persisting, and thank you to your dad. I'm so sorry for your loss, and
mm,
but he sounds like an amazing person, and it's
mhm.
beautiful that he played such a role in inspiring you to keep going despite the bullies.
Despite the bullies, yeah, he had a certain bravery when it came to human rights issues. So I've hoped to be as brave as him throughout my life. He was a great role model.
That's amazing. Wow. And so what year was that when your path crossed with Eugene Ingram?
That was 91.
Wow.
So that continued 91, 92, and then he moved on to harassing someone else, which was unfortunate. But yeah, he would follow me home, be parked in front of my house. Um, And I delayed, people were getting on the internet, and there was this new thing called the internet at the time, and soon after that, and people were developing websites, and I was actually too fearful of having my face out there, my name out there, especially when I suddenly had a family with young kids. And I remember as my kids were getting a little older, I asked them, I said, listen, people are having trouble finding resources, and I really want to have this thing called a website I need to put together to let people know where to find me. But that might mean that someone's going to be parked out in front of our house, and I need to know that's okay with you. Which was interesting. And my oldest was like, that's super cool. Like, she had no idea.
Kids are the best. Unfortunately, we've had to have many conversations with our kids.
I'm sure.
And, we just always have tried to help them understand, the many different aspects of how Scientology still impacts our lives to this day, because we're whistleblowers, because we are, have spoken out publicly, and because Mark wrote a book, and, because of all those aspects, and and also because of the impact of Scientology disconnection on our family. Our kids have never known their grandparents other than Mark's dad, who passed in 2019. Of Mark's parents and my parents, that's the only grandparent they've ever known. And, so even just educating, I personally felt very strongly that I needed to help them in an appropriate, healthy way. Because I experienced disconnection with the loss of my dad when I was 3. And I remember very clearly thinking it was my fault. So that was my concern for my kids. And anyway, it's been a path, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I mean, disconnection at 3. Oh, my goodness gracious. Right. I mean, your story is so compelling. It's so heartfelt and so moving. And I remember reading Mark's book, which I still tell people about, because I said, if you want to get a sense of day to day, and just reading through the schedule and needing to run to do this and do that, and the deadlines and the being yelled at, your heart races just reading about it. Right. But I can only imagine actually being there and experiencing.
Right. Yeah. No, that's amazing. Well, and so, wow. So 91 all the way to now, are there significant events that happened that continued to inspire your work, particularly with former Scientologists? Obviously, I know you do a lot of other work too.
Yeah, I do. I mean, I work with people from a variety of different cultic groups, and also kind of cultic relationships, and have expanded into dealing with malignant narcissists and being in a relationship with or raised by a malignant narcissist, because people would hear me speak and then call me and say, I know I wasn't in a cult, but that sounds like my marriage. And so they kind of informed me about the crossover, and it makes perfect sense because so many cults are run by people with that personality disorder. So, the outcome is going to be similar, and the methods of control are going to be similar.
Right.
What I've been very moved by the stories of people contemplating suicide. That was a driving force for me, hearing about these people who really felt like they were left without a choice. And it is a cruel thing to do to anyone, to say, this is the only life that is safe for you to be living, in this life within Scientology, no matter how miserable you are and how you're treated or mistreated. If you leave, then, your life will basically be over. And so people do feel like then their only way out is really to to end their life. And I know that that has been true for a number of people, and other people who have come to me saying that they got to this point and they sort of heard this, I don't know what it was, a voice of reason or hope. There must be another option. It can't just
Yes.
be that it's either that or nothing. It's like being in an abusive relationship and feeling like you have to stay because the rest of the world has been made to look so scary to you,
Right.
that you have to stay being abused. And then your only way out is to end it. So those stories have been very moving and very motivating for me to keep going. I think also hearing about how hard it is for people who then are disconnected from, who are left really unanchored and having to find each other. And that's part of the reason that I started a support group, so people could find each other,
Yes.
because it's a terrible thing to feel alone. You already feel like your life has been so different and it's hard to translate it to people in the world outside. And then you don't want to feel alone with that. So hearing also how much people are so scared of even just telling their story, and watching people be heckled and abused while they're telling their story at conferences and other places. I mean, it's that also, just seeing how the walking wounded are further wounded
Right.
by the people who wounded them to begin with. And so that also can compel, I think, people who want to be able to help to feel like, okay, we need to be here. We need to be a force that helps people feel protected, but also that they have a safe place to land.
Yes, completely. Yeah, no, it's really quite something, and I think that I do agree with you that there is great power in knowing that you're not alone, and that your experience is, while you might in that moment think that you're alone completely, but actually there are many other people who have suffered the same or worse. Not, I don't believe in comparing traumas,
Mm-hmm.
but but who understand what you're going through, and to know that there are resources and there are people who care, and there's a beautiful world out here. It's not the quote unquote dangerous environment that Hubbard outlined. And yeah, no, that's absolutely amazing. Are there so if somebody is considering, like, as they call them, let's say an under the radar, or even just contemplating the confusion of the programming of Scientology, are there baby steps, like beginning resources you would suggest as a kind of a first step?
Yeah, so I think it's interesting that you say it, just even using that analogy of taking steps. When you're involved in something that pushes you with such intensity, it is important to realize that healing often is at a different pace. And it doesn't mean you're not doing it fast enough. It means you're doing it in a healthy way that's aligned with your nervous system, and that it does mean going in steps and baby steps, and that's okay. And you don't have to somehow find this magic thing that's going to rid you of these thoughts in a week's time, or something else that there isn't that kind of auditing model of like, let's dive in and heal you. That's not the way things really work psychologically. And so for people to be patient with themselves and know that they'll get there, and that it's going to feel messy and it's going to feel confusing, but that things that are done in a healthy way often take time. It's like dieting, right? Or exercising, right? You're not going to go just lift a 300-pound weight your first time going anywhere, doing anything, right? You'll die, right?
Right.
And so it's good to know that this is incremental, but that, there's still a path that you can follow, even if it feels like it's taking a while.
Yes.
It's also good to know that the world is a nicer place than you were told it was, just as you were saying.
Yeah.
That there is going to be kindness, and not with everyone, of course, because that would be Pollyanna and weird for me to think that. But
Right.
but typically, people are going to be offering a hand or showing sympathy or something, and so
And that sympathy is not a bad thing, actually.
it's not a
Sympathy,
bad thing.
empathy, it's not a bad thing.
Right, exactly right. It's not getting in the way of anything. It's not stopping you from something. In fact, it's giving you, I think, a certain amount of faith that the world can be a place that you can feel safe in, and feel cared for in, and that's a really nice thing. And to let it happen, to feel, if you can, a little more comfortable with receiving help, which sometimes means also feeling a little more comfortable with asking for what you need, which is a whole other challenge. But sometimes that's how you get what you need. And it's not weakness for you to ask for something or that you need, or even to need it. That's just being a human being. And some people are very glad that you asked for what you needed so they could provide it.
Yes.
Right. So connecting with society, being kind of in seeing it as more benevolent than you were ever taught that it was, is an important thing to just sort of notice around you. But I think the steps that are important also are finding out about what this thing is that you were put through, whether it's learning about Scientology or about the methods of control. So you can
Yes.
see this was the technique. This is why it was used on you. This is how it served the group, not you.
Mhm.
And noticing also, this is something that I think is really important. A lot of people will come to me thinking there's a lot wrong with them. They've been given a lot of diagnoses by Scientology, about their failings, about their weaknesses, about somehow their needs that are not normal. Most people are really fine, and the thing that wasn't fine about them was that they were being mistreated in Scientology.
Right.
Right. And then they need to almost kind of be able to be open, I think, with someone who knows about real diagnoses and say, this is what I was told is true about me. Is it true? Do I have to worry about this about myself? And so to find out who you are and who you're not, really, and like
Right.
really get this much more accurate definition of yourself, I think can be really confidence boosting, because, a group that needs to be needed is going to need for you to feel that you have a lot wrong with you, so that
Mhm.
you continuously need their help for whatever it is they've decided is wrong with you.
Right.
And
It's a great
right,
point. Yeah.
and
My
usually
my
there isn't
mother tried
anything
to.
wrong.
Yeah,
Mhm.
no, you reminded me, my mother, tried to, well, not tried to, she convinced me to let her, audit me, do
Mhm,
sessions with
mhm,
me when I
mhm,
was 6, and I remember that was my argument. I was like, "Why do I need to do this? There's nothing wrong with me."
mhm. Right.
Oh my
Mhm,
gosh, I just had that flashback, but yeah, no, that's a really good point, and it's crazy also in retrospect to me that, the indoctrination and programming was so extreme that it felt like I was in a brick house, like the walls, like, and that it was impossible to get out. But yet,
mhm, mhm,
yes, there was a physical aspect to that because, the location I was at, I was physically trapped there. But even more so emotionally and psychologically and familially, and by virtue of my family and my friends, and layer upon layer upon layer of leverage and control, can be very difficult to even think that it's even possible to overcome those
mhm.
barriers.
Right. Right. Oh, it feels like an impossibility. And I think that's also, why people who have left are, you're barred from having contact with them, so that they can't say, hey, I'm over here on the other side of the brick wall. Things are good. Things are
Yes.
right. I mean, yes, having some post-trauma from the experience. Yes, there are things that I'm needing to deal with, but like jump on in, the water's fine.
Right.
And they don't want you to know that.
Right. That's a really good point. Totally. Like and of course the reverse is true. Not only do they disallow any contact, but also they tell the remaining members, oh, they're doing awful and they're failing and they're this and they're that. And and you think, oh my goodness,
Mhm.
wow, it really is scary out there.
Mhm. Right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. One time I actually talked to people who were in a support group, and I said, "What?" Because that was the subject one night, of knowing that their reputations have been so sullied by the group because they left, that
Mhm.
they know that their family, their siblings, their whomever, their former spouse is hearing all these horrible stories. So I said, so what do you know has been told about you? And then they went around and they said, hi, my name is Carol. Nice to meet you. I seem to be a drug addict. And then the next person like,
Oh
oh,
my
I also
gosh.
am a killer. I commit, yeah, I'm homicidal. Oh yeah, me too. And just all of the things that all these really lovely people have to deal with, knowing that, that the group doesn't really care about seeing people accurately. They care about designing a way of looking at someone that helps support the fact that there has to be something wrong with you to show why you left. Because if you
Right.
were perfectly fine, you would have stayed. If it's all opposite day, every day, you know?
Yes, totally. Yeah, and obviously I talk to Mark and I both do, and through the work the Aftermath Foundation does, we talk to people very regularly just coming out. And one of the things I always say is, thank you so much for trusting me and for having the courage to reach out, because that's a huge step. And I appreciate that. That probably was quite scary to take that step, but thank you.
Mm,
And anyway, it's I don't know. I think we each have our paths, right? And
yeah.
I spent the first 30 years of my life in Scientology, and I think at the time that I first spoke to you, I had thought, well, I'll help people if they reach out to me, but I was still very scared. But finding my voice and speaking out, certainly for me personally, not that it's the right path for everybody, but in my case, it was incredibly therapeutic.
Mhm. Incredibly. And also from hearing, your story and all that happened in your childhood, and being torn away from parents. I mean, I remember feeling so overjoyed when I found out that you became a parent yourself.
Yes.
Uh, and you get to have that part of your life, and I think heal some of those wounds too, which is, not the reason that you have kids, but still, it's a really nice outcome.
Yes.
Um, and that you also, I think it also says something about someone's nature, their true nature, that they instinctively know how to parent, even though it wasn't provided for them. Which, yeah, that says a lot about you.
Oh, well, thank you. I appreciate it. You reminded me of another question that I would love your perspective on. So, being that I was born into Scientology, it occurred to me recently that from a recovery perspective, like, how do you even know what your pitfalls are? Like, there's not a roadmap to kind of reflect on, like, oh, there's this and there's that. Like, there's no checklist of the indoctrination and how to walk that back. What are your thoughts about that?
Mm-hmm. Right. So I think you can learn a lot about yourself when you go into society, into sort of mainstream society, and you start comparing notes with others, with other people who are your age-ish, and other people who might also be new parents, or whatever the situation is. And you want to see if you're similar or different, and how different. And you want to be able to kind of learn how to do it in ways that might be healthier, that you weren't given the opportunity to learn about. But if you notice that you're having a knee-jerk reaction, like you just suddenly had this huge fear about something, and you realize you're the only one in a room that's just sweating and your heart's racing and everyone else seems fine, then you want to take a look at those moments, right? And you also want to see about the programming that you had, that, that you're going to say things and believe things and wonder where that just came from.
Right.
And so, people who haven't been raised in cults also have that. I tell this story where I've raised 3 kids. I never yelled at my kids. It's just not in my nature. I don't raise my voice. In fact, there are times I wish I could be heard in a room. Like, I wish I didn't have to use a microphone sometimes, but I just don't. I can't project. Whatever, it's a problem. So, but still, it's just not me to yell. But I do remember one of my parents, I won't name which one, but one of my parents was more punitive in their way of parenting, and the other one was more like, let's talk about it. So the punitive one, I think when you hear something repeated, it does get under your skin and you suddenly adopt it, and it might not really be your nature. And I remember my siblings would fight a lot my older siblings would fight a lot at the kitchen table. And one of my parents was a banisher, who would say, go to your room. Like, that was the way of dealing with it, which is not really a way to deal with it. But anyway,
Yes.
that was their method. And one of my kids was giving one of my other kids kind of a hard time. I think not on purpose, but they weren't reading the room and realizing how much they were bringing their sibling close to tears. And I just said, just go. I just pointed my finger. I said, just go. And my older child stood up and then looked at me and said, wait, go where? Like, what? What are you talking about? And I remember thinking, and I said to her, I actually don't know. I don't know what's supposed to happen. Like, why? I didn't even know why I said that. But there was this conflict at the dinner table, and it just suddenly came out of me, and I had to look at it and think, wait, that's not how you address things. That didn't work when we were growing up. That's not going to work now. Let me look at that. So we all are a product of what we've been exposed to. Sure. But you want to see, does it work for you? Is it like the people around you? And when you also connect with people who have a certain style that you value, like parents who are parenting in a way that feels right to you as you look at it, or the people who just are nice people who you want to be friends with, how are they approaching things? And are you finding that you're kind of similar to them, or are you so vastly different that you're realizing you really need to look at how you've been programmed to, like, not give sympathy because that's going to be harming a person, right? And here someone is dealing with a loss and people are leaning in and wanting to offer food or wanting to do something, and you're holding back because you've been taught that's what they need. And then you're thinking, okay, no, actually that's setting me apart from the people around me, and it's having me come across like someone who doesn't care. Let me look at that.
Yes, very much so. It's interesting actually that you say that now, because on reflection, obviously Mark and I we just had our 32nd wedding anniversary. Yay.
Congratulations.
Thank you. But it's interesting though, because in hearing you talk about that comparison, one of the things that most amazed me about him when we first met was that nothing ruffled his feathers. It was just water off a duck's back. And so even perhaps unknowingly in that moment, I was just this is my person. This is my best friend, my love of my life. I love this guy. He's amazing. How does he not care? How is his world not crumbling, like, from various different things? It was the rebel in him that I saw and identified with, that was so different than my perspective.
Right.
Like,
yeah,
it's very interesting. Fascinating. And so are there any other, like, so in addition to starting to ask questions, or like, are there specific books that you recommend to people just starting to ask questions and look around? And I'm not sure. I suppose the reason I ask that is because, for me anyway, when I was first getting out, anything that used the word cult was like, can't look at that. And obviously I got past that, but that's again kind of goes back to my baby steps question as well, with more context.
Right. So I'm looking at my bookshelf, Hill, because I have a whole bunch of books. And there are some that don't have, the word cult in them. But I always value whatever, Steve Hassan puts out, and Janja Lalich, and the people who, like, Janja's book, Take Back Your Life, I think has been such a valuable resource. And I'm
actually reading that one again right now myself.
Oh, you are? Yeah.
Yes.
Right.
Brilliant.
I mean, right. And so I think that there are some also about Scientology that are a bit harder to get through when you've just come out, because they really get into kind of the perversion of it all. When you hear people talking about how it all began, and learning things from sort of behind the scenes. Like, I mean, I remember talking to Jamie DeWolf, and he was telling me about his family history, and that they're all sort of shaking their heads about Elron and, him getting started doing his thing, and how some people were just not going to get involved because they thought something was really abnormal about it all, and others got sucked in. And just, I think having that perspective, it's good that you get to see that this is someone who was seen as not well by a lot of his family. And I think that's good insight. Then I think, listening to podcasts, hearing what you have to say, having people tell their stories, and hearing also, for a lot of people, and I think it gives them sometimes some courage, that it can help to tell your story, and it doesn't have to be a scary thing, as long as you're telling it in a way where you're not being pushed to be more sensationalistic about it, which you can kind of sense at times. And those are the people who sometimes feel burned when they go on a show and they're pushed to tell the more salacious things, and it's kind of missing the point, the human part of it. But I think also learning just about, then going to learning about emotional intelligence, learning about how people get along in the world, and how they can read a room, and how they learn how to have a difficult conversation, and how to read someone's face, and just know, because I think when you're in Scientology, I think a lot of people feel ill-equipped to handle dicey situations, to handle themselves in the workplace, to handle themselves in relationships. I mean, it's lovely for you that you had this relationship already, and a lot of people had very hard time going into the dating world. And, how do I even just have a conversation? How do I learn how to just talk about nothing, just do chit chat? I've never done that. And I don't know how to talk
with
about the weather.
No purpose, no meaning,
right?
Just like
right? Yeah, there's no lesson I need to teach, and there's I can just talk about the weather. What?
and very different, by the way, than Good Roads Fair Weather, of course.
Oh yes, absolutely right. Yeah, right. Yeah, I think really getting to know, like, there's a book called How to Know a Person, and those kinds of books I think are really helpful, just in terms of seeing how to read someone. and how to feel that you're capable of handling yourself in certain social situations so that you don't have to sequester yourself, so you don't have to be isolated for fear. I mean, I've talked to a lot of people who have left Scientology who said that they've had to tone down their rhetoric. They've had to, use a softer tone. They've needed to know that their job is not necessarily to give unsolicited advice.
Right.
Sometimes you just listen. And, it's really hard because you have a million ideas that you want to share or you want to cure something or do. But that sometimes that's not what's socially needed in that moment and not the
Yes.
wisest choice.
Yeah. Absolutely. No, you're right. And I think that, at least from my perspective, two of the things that are the biggest struggle, I would say, one is asking for help. And the other is knowing how and when to set boundaries, not only for yourself, but for other people as well, which you reminded me of that with your comment just now, because it's such a foreign concept when you're born and raised in Scientology to have boundaries. And, that's like, what's that?
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. What is that? And sometimes you don't realize in an intellectual sense that you needed to set a boundary, but sometimes you feel it. Like you might get this tension in your stomach or in your shoulders. You might get a headache or you're clenching your jaw because you just said yes to one too many things. Or
Yep.
you just didn't say no when you really wanted to say no, and you could just feel it, and you can feel that you're resisting it or that you're kind of avoiding the person's phone calls. Like something was off. You didn't honor how you really felt and what you really needed. And that's a muscle actually to work out, being able to learn how to say no and when. It's something that I talk to a lot of people about. And one of the things, not that you asked, but I often offer this little bit of guidance to people who are really uncomfortable saying no, where I will encourage them to narrate their discomfort out loud, like to say, hey, you know what? I know you asked me to chair this committee or whatever it is. And I'm already only sleeping 4 or 5 hours a night because I said yes to a lot of things. And I know that I said yes, but I'm really feeling overwhelmed. And I think I need to, as part of my healing from never being allowed to say no, because that would have been wrong or I would have been punished for it. I'm learning how. And sometimes I have a delayed impact and I can tell I said yes to too many things, but maybe a few days late. And so I would love it if you could just support me in setting my boundaries now and doing what's best for me. And that means that I'm going to need to say no to this.
Yeah.
And I feel really bad about it. It's really hard for me. And if I can in the future, I will, and I'll be sure to be in touch. And you just sort of
Nice. That's
say it.
brilliant. Yes, no, absolutely. I know. And yeah, I mean, there's been so many times I'm, I have a very hard time saying no. It's sometimes frustrating to Mark which I understand. He often jokes that I have more jobs than a Jamaican. No offense to anybody, but I laugh because it's there's truth in it, and yeah. So I'm trying to get better at kind of recognizing those physical signs, and instead of launching into something, just actually do the opposite and take a step back and go, no, something's going on here. Let's pause and reflect.
Right? Let's pause and
Yeah.
reflect. And then also be able to withstand someone else being disappointed in you that you said no.
Right.
That's really hard.
Yeah.
And so I think sometimes inviting someone into your journey, like inviting them to help support you doing what's best for you, will sometimes help them not take it out on you and say, but you said, they might say, oh, okay, got you. Yes, that is disappointing, but right, if you said yes because you felt like you had to and you were too afraid to say no, yeah, I want to be able to help you with this, and thanks for letting me know. Sometimes you won't even know that you've bitten off more than you can chew, except that you're finishing dinner and you know you're supposed to go to a meeting and you're dreading going and you just don't feel like going anywhere. And that's your sign that
Yep.
this wasn't the right thing for you. But dealing with people's disappointment is really very hard, because when you're in a situation like, or a group like Scientology, you have to keep everyone happy with you.
Right. Yeah, completely. I know. I was thinking about that recently, even on something so seemingly benign as, so for example, I was taught how to do touch assists in
Hmm.
Scientology when I was
Hmm.
7. And because, anyway, I won't get into the story, but it occurred to me the other day, like even the fact that I'm now, as a 7-year-old, learning that, oh, this is what you do, and you keep doing it until the person feels better. So therefore, it kind of is instilling this, it's instilling programming and indoctrination that this will work. There's no asking any questions. There's no other way. It's our way, their way, or the highway.
Hmm.
That mentality of, and that as a 7-year-old, I must keep doing this on my mother in this case until she says she feels better. Again, it's seemingly benign, and yet at every turn on reflection, it's not.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
It's definitely not. Right. That whole touch assist thing is very interesting. Um, it can give you also, as a young child, this sense of having a magical power.
Mm.
And that also can play with your head.
Yep.
Because you can feel like, unless I'm there, then they're not going to get better. And you can feel this ultimate sense of responsibility because you hold that power.
Right.
Which I think is a very unfair thing to do to a child. And it's nice to, I think anyone feels good feeling like they can participate in the healing of other people if that's what they care about. But to also be given the sense that you have to just keep doing it until it works.
Yep.
That's so destructive. I mean, it would be fine if they could say to you, listen, this might be helpful to them. Why don't you try it for a few minutes, see if it works? And if it doesn't, then it might be better for them to go to talk to this person or go to see a doctor. There are these other choices. So you're
Yep.
off the hook. You can help a little, but you don't have the sense of needing to like tell someone to sit there and, for hours until it quote unquote works. Because they'll probably say after a while that it works just because they're tired of
Right.
having it done.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. I mean, oh my gosh. And again, gave touch assistant and also was the recipient of them. And it does, from such a young age, you're like, well, I have to say I feel better because otherwise I'm going to be here
Right.
for what, days on end. Like we're
Right.
just
And I'm hungry and I'm right. Exactly.
right. Exactly. Like that's not going to
Uh-huh.
work.
Right.
Oh
Oh,
my gosh. Oh shoot. I was going to ask you another question and I totally forgot, but oh, I know what I was going to ask. Okay. So another question I'd love to hear your thoughts on.
mm,
So obviously, and maybe you don't have a firm answer on this one way or the other, but what are your thoughts on the importance of a therapist understanding the language of Scientology or not in order
mhm.
to be able to help a former Scientologist with recovery?
Mm. So specifically understanding the language. I think it's I think it's a very important thing whether the therapist knows about the language ahead of time, um, or that they're open to learning. That,
Mm,
if they need, I can let them borrow my dictionary. That's just way too big. It's just filled with so much word salad. It's amazing. But
yes, word
right,
salad for sure.
Right? Oh my gosh. But so I think it, I think sometimes therapists, they know what they know and they feel that what they know is enough. And but in this realm, it's not. In this realm, I think therapists need to be open to learning about the different kind of control and the manipulation, even just that kind of nuanced difference of learning the difference between gaslighting and self-gaslighting, which is so much about being on the RPF or being in Scientology in general, and what happens in cults, that you learn to gaslight yourself. That's a whole other level that I think is important for therapists to understand and to be open to understanding. And I think it's just like, if I were to treat someone who was from another country, I would know that I'm at a disadvantage if I don't speak their language, because there's something about the language that helps you really get something in a very unique way, in a really kind of integral way. And so when I was first starting out, I was a little familiar with the language, but I remember saying to clients, I'm not familiar with that term, or I'm not familiar with how you use that word, because I can see you're using it in a different way. And I would make a list and just write down the terms and how they're used, and then help someone see if it is a word that's used in English also, how we use it, so to speak, like handle.
Right.
And
Good one. It's a
right.
great one. Yeah.
Because I heard that word a lot. And then I thought, no, it seems like they're using it in a different way. Let me see if I can help them retranslate it back. But yeah, I remember keeping a running list of words that I wanted to learn, until I really got the lexicon. So I think,
Wow.
yeah, either a therapist who knows it or is open to learning it is very important.
Yeah, that makes sense, because, and it's funny that you say it that way, because so many times now I'll be like talking with Mark, or, on a podcast or whatever, and I'll be like, wait, is that a real word? Is that a real word?
Right.
And
Yeah,
if it is, does it mean the same thing?
exactly.
Because very often it does not. And,
Mhm.
and again, it's just this strange twist that, in my mind, weaponized language, in my mind, to
Mhm.
go, and again, like the self-gaslighting, I haven't heard that before. I think that's a brilliant way to put it, because it 100% is that, mental prison that you wind up in, that you have to break out of to get free.
Right, exactly. That you are taught to perpetuate on yourself.
Right.
Um, and so I think some therapists might think, oh, now that you're out of the group, then the gaslighting is done. But no, you've learned how to reinforce those messages in your own mind.
Right.
And so just to have that awareness, I mean, I've learned most of what I use now to help people from my clients themselves. Just, they've taught me so much. And,
Yeah.
but yeah, I think learning the language, helping people see how words are used, helping them also learn to use them the way that they're used by society at large, helps people reconnect and helps people
Yeah.
feel a part of the world again. And so it's a really important piece of this.
Yeah. Interesting. And just to add comment on a second layer of that.
Mm.
So for me, when I got out, I tried immediately to stop using the language, but
Mhm.
the language only represents the mechanisms. So,
Mhm.
it's both layers of it, is my only comment there. That's
Mhm.
so important to reflect on, and just peel that back, walk that back, whatever, in the recovery process. It's okay, so one last question.
Yeah, sure.
We've been told a few times, comments about the time to recover from Scientology compared to other abusive cults. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, right. I find that it does take sometimes longer. But it also depends on a couple of factors. Like if you were born and raised, right? I mean, you had a lot to undo, but a lot to learn just about being in the world, right? So being first generation versus second or third, that makes a lot of difference too, just in how long it takes to adjust. But I think also for a lot of people, they were traumatized by how they were treated there, either because they were pushed beyond what was physically capable for them and safe for them, or they were taken away from their anchors, from the people who they loved, and they're traumatized in that way, and then have issues around attachment and trust in relationships, and also dealt with sometimes medical neglect and psychological neglect. And those are not unlike what happens in a lot of other groups. But there is a certain intensity within Scientology that is hard for people to get over. I think that, there's a heart racing part of it where people come out and physiologically have to learn how to shift and how to just breathe and how to put their feet up and how to be okay with sleeping enough or just sitting and having a meal that's longer than 5 minutes. Because they're used to going. And so because you need to make a shift in your language, in your belief system, in how you've learned to self-diagnose in a negative way yourself, how you've learned to be either like you look down at the rest of the world and now you're in that world. And what does that mean about you? Just your self-confidence, and also making the physiological shifts to be in a more relaxed state. And also know that you matter, that your mental health matters, that your health matters. And also, because when people come out of Scientology, they've been made to feel so afraid of enlisting anyone's help for therapy, for anything. They will often spend a long time suffering in silence. And that delays being able to start feeling better.
Right.
And so, it can take a number of years before you just feel like you're able to land. And, that's why I try to do as much, and I'm sure you do the same, right? As much education and prevention out there for this subject so people don't get entangled to begin with, because you see how long it takes to help.
Completely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Rachel. And I will list to your podcast, your website, and anything else you would like me to include for anyone who would like to learn more about your work. But truly, thanks for being the first psychologist I ever spoke to. Thanks for an amazing conversation. I'm just so grateful for your work.
Oh, and I'm so grateful for yours, and so respect you and what you're doing and where you've come, and I'm sure what you're doing out there has had this exponential impact.
I hope so.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, absolutely. I know so. So it's wonderful to talk to you.
Awesome. Well, thank you so very much. And I will hope to be able to do part 2 sometime down the line. And I would love to come on your podcast again too sometime. But thank you again. And I will talk to you soon.
Perfect. Great to talk to you.
You too.
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to help support the channel, feel free to check out the merch store link in the description. We have Hail Xenu, Xenu is my homeboy, and BFG branded mouse pads, shirts, mugs, all sorts of other stuff in there that helps us to bring you new content on a regular basis. You can also pick up a copy of my book, Blown for Good, Behind the Iron Curtain of Scientology, in hardback, Kindle, and Audible versions as well. There's also a link to our podcast, and you can get that on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you'd like to watch another video, you can click on this link right here, or you can click on this one here, or you can click on the subscribe button right here. Thanks a lot. Until next time.